In this video, we're going to dive into the topic of dissertation and thesis structure. We're going to look at the typical structure of a dissertation or thesis, section by section, as well as the key aspects of each section. We'll also share some useful tips and tricks to help you craft a dissertation that impresses your markers and, most importantly, earns marks. So go ahead, grab a cup of coffee, grab a cup of tea, whatever works for you. Let's jump into it. Hey, welcome to Grad Coach TV, where we demystify and simplify the seemingly bizarre world of academia. My name's Emma, and today we're going to decrypt the typical dissertation or thesis structure so that you can structure your research project in a smooth, flowing, logical way that carries a golden thread throughout. Now, before we jump into it, I've got to throw one disclaimer at you. What we'll look at today is the typical structure for a traditional dissertation or thesis, especially ones in the social sciences. Now, some universities will have slightly different approaches, perhaps with a few extra bells and whistles here and there, but the core components usually remain the same. So be sure to check in with your institution to see if they have any specific requirements before you finalize your structure. Now, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the typical structure of a dissertation or thesis, and then jump into each of the sections to see what they're all about. Generally, there are 8 core sections that make up a typical dissertation, thesis, or formal research project. Universities have a variety of labels for these types of projects. These sections are, number 1, the opening admin section, which includes the title page, abstract or executive summary, and the table of contents. Number 2, the introduction chapter, which introduces and justifies your research. Number 3, the literature review chapter, which looks at the existing research in your space. Number 4, methodology chapter, which outlines how you will design your own research. Number 5, results chapter, where you present the data generated by your research. Number 6, the discussion chapter, where you explain what the data means in light of your research. Number 7, conclusions chapter, where you bring it all together and answer your research questions. And number 8, the closing section, which includes your reference list and appendices. We'll dig into each of these sections in more detail, but before we do that, it's useful to understand that this default dissertation or thesis structure, it reflects the research process as a whole. In other words, the research process involves, number 1, identifying your research questions and objectives, which is what you do in the introduction chapter. Number 2, assessing what research already exists in relation to your questions, which you cover in the literature review chapter. Number 3, undertaking your own research, which you cover in the methodology and results chapters. And lastly, number 4, answering your original research questions, which you do in the discussion and conclusion chapters. So this dissertation structure, it's designed to reflect the research process as a whole, which ensures that your writing has a smooth, logical flow. Okay, with that out of the way, let's take a closer look at each of these sections. Right, so let's take a look at the opening section of a typical dissertation or thesis. Now, generally, there are 4 components here. Number 1, the title or cover page. Number 2, the acknowledgement section. Number 3, the abstract or the executive summary. And number 4, the table of contents and lists of figures and tables. Let's take a look at each of these. First up, the title page, which is pretty straightforward. This usually contains the title of your project along with your student details, like your name and student ID. As a rule of thumb, you should aim to keep your title concise. There's nothing more off-putting than really lengthy titles. Now, I've seen some titles that run over 4 lines, which makes me want to just skip right past it. So, how do you compile a good dissertation title? Well, ideally, your title should very briefly encapsulate the following. 1, your research topic, what you'll be researching. 2, the context, what location, area, or industry you're looking at. 3, your broad methodology, for example, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed. So let's take a look at a practical example. A quantitative investigation into the drivers of trust in insurance brokers, a British context. So right there, in one line, we've captured all three essential points: the topic, the context, and the methodology. In other words, the reader quickly understands that this is going to be a numbers-based, quantitative piece of research that is looking to understand what factors cultivate trust in insurance brokers within the United Kingdom. Keep this topic in mind as we'll circle back to it later on. The next component of your opening section is the acknowledgement section. Now, this section is basically just an opportunity to thank those who have helped you along the way. Typically, you'll give a little shout out to your advisors, your supervisor, loved ones, family, even friends. Now, this is a personal section, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. You can even thank your dog for keeping you company during those long nights of writer's block. But in general, this section shouldn't be more than 1 page long. Keep it short and sweet. You're not going to earn any extra marks by crafting a poem of gratitude to your research supervisor. Next up is the abstract, or for some universities, the executive summary. This is simply a summary of each section of your dissertation or thesis woven into a smooth narrative. In other words, your abstract should cover each of the main chapters of your document in the same order, highlighting the key points. It should not introduce any new information or arguments. It should only summarize what you've already written somewhere else. A good abstract or executive summary should allow a first-time reader to understand the essence of your project. In other words, what you were trying to find out, your research objectives, how you investigated it, your methodology, and what your findings were, your conclusions. Let's look at examples sticking to the same research topic that I mentioned earlier. At a minimum, your abstract would need to explain that you were looking to identify which factors cultivate and increase consumer trust in UK-based insurance brokers and why that's worth investigating, so your justification. You'd also need to briefly explain your research methodology and why you designed your research the way that you did. And last but not least, you'd need to state what your key findings were, which factors were most important in terms of cultivating trust. Now, keep in mind that although this section is right up front in your dissertation or thesis, it should be the last thing that you write. So only tackle this section once you've completed the rest of your dissertation. It is no use trying to summarize your work before you've finalized it, or you'll just end up rewriting it multiple times. Also, doing this section right at the very end serves as a bit of a sanity check. It helps ensure that everything ties together neatly and that there is a smooth narrative throughout the document. The final component of your opening section is the table of contents, along with the lists of figures and tables. Now, these are pretty self-explanatory. They simply list the sections and their respective page numbers. Now, a tip to make your life a little easier, make use of Microsoft Word's automatic table of contents generator, which will build the table of contents based on your heading structure. This ensures that all the pages and their numbers are 100% correct, and it looks neat and clean. I'll include a link below this video to show you how to do this. Now, along with the abstract, the table of contents should be completed last, or you'll need to update it every time you add something to your document. Right, that covers the opening section of the typical dissertation or thesis structure. So let's move on to the next section, the introduction chapter. All right, let's look at the first and possibly most important chapter of your dissertation or thesis, the introduction chapter. As you'd expect, this chapter's job is to introduce your research aims and objectives, but even more importantly, it must justify your research. It needs to make a clear argument about why your research is important and needed. So what goes into this chapter? Well, typically you'll need to cover a few things. The what, meaning what you'll be researching and in what context. What are your research aims and objectives and core research questions? What is the scope of your research and what will you not cover? Next, you'll need to discuss the why. In other words, why is this important? What new knowledge will it provide? Who will benefit from this knowledge? And in what way? The next logical step is the how. Now, you don't need to go into detail here, but you should give a brief high-level overview of how you'll approach your research in terms of methodology. For example, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. And lastly, you should briefly outline the high-level structure of your dissertation or thesis. This way your reader knows what to expect, and they can jump to specific sections that might be of interest to them. So as you can see, the introduction chapter sets the scene for your reader, and of course your marker. It provides a high-level overview of the what, why, and how of your research, so that the reader has a clear view of where you're going with your research. At Grad Coach, we see so many students that rushed through their introduction chapter, and as a result, they didn't have a clear direction for their research, and they ended up wasting a lot of time on things that were not relevant to their project. So it's important that you put the time and effort into crafting a rock-solid introduction chapter. A quick side note, while you will generally write this section in the early stages of your research, it's quite normal to come back around and revise or rework sections as your research progresses. So don't stress if your research takes a slight turn along the way. You can always update this section down the line. Right, now that we've got the introduction out of the way, it's time to look at the next chapter, the literature review. Let's look at the literature review chapter now. So now that you've outlined your research aims and objectives, the next step is to discuss what research already exists and what that research says in relation to your own research. In other words, the literature review is basically about seeing what is already known, or at least theorized, about your topic and research questions. This is a really important step, as you don't want to reinvent the wheel or repeat existing research. Instead, you want to build onto what is already known. By doing this, you'll be standing on the shoulders of giants and adding to the body of knowledge as opposed to just regurgitating what's already been done. So, what do you need to cover in the literature review? Well, basically, you need to present and synthesize the existing research that's relevant to your research question. Synthesize is the key word here. A literature review is not just a summary of the existing research. He said this and she said that and so on. A good literature review is about synthesizing the existing research, grouping ideas, concepts, and theories in relation to your own research, identifying what's agreed upon and what's not agreed upon, and what areas are lacking research, and pulling it all together into a foundation for your own research. Let's look at a practical example. If your research is about the factors that cultivate trust in insurance brokers, your literature review should clearly identify which factors have been proposed in existing research, which are agreed upon, which are contested, which may be missing in specific context, which methodologies are used, and so on. By doing this, you are building a base for your own research. There are various ways to structure your literature review, including chronologically, thematically, and by methodology. But the right structure depends on the nature of your research. Now, that is way beyond the scope of this video, so I'll include a link below this video to a Grad Coach blog post. It covers literature review structure in detail. I'll also include a link to another Grad Coach video that explains how to write a literature review from start to finish. So check out those before you start your literature review. Right, now that we've covered the literature review chapter, it's time to move on to the methodology chapter. So let's do it. On to the dreaded methodology chapter. This chapter is all about the how of your research. In other words, how will you design your research, collect your data, and analyze it to help answer your research questions? In this chapter, you need to specify exactly how you'll approach your research, and even more importantly, why you chose to go that route. In a dissertation or thesis, the marker or markers want to see that you have a firm understanding of research methodology and design. They want to know that you know what techniques and methods to use in a specific situation. So it's really important to justify every choice you make in this chapter to show that you know which tool to use for the job at hand. Okay, so what exactly do you need to cover in the methodology chapter? Well, the core design choices you typically need to discuss are, number one, your research philosophy. For example, positivist, interpretivist, or pragmatist. Number two, your research approach. For example, inductive or deductive. Number three, your methodology. Qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. Number four, your time horizon. For example, cross-sectional or longitudinal. Number five, your data. What data will you collect and how? For example, interviews, surveys, etc. Number six, your sampling strategy. Who will you collect data from? Number seven, your analysis techniques. For example, statistical analysis, thematic analysis, etc. The right approach to each of these design choices depends on your research aims, objectives, and questions, as well as practical limitations. For example, for most research projects, you won't be able to undertake longitudinal research due to time constraints of the degree program. This is why it's really important to justify every choice you make here. Your choice might not be ideal, but as long as it's well justified, it can still earn you marks. If some of these words sound like gibberish to you, or maybe you just want to learn more about research methodology and the research design choices, check out the Grad Coach blog, where we explain these choices in plain language. I'll include a link below this video. Right. Now that we've covered the methodology chapter, the next step is to actually undertake the research and present your findings, which is what the results chapter is all about. Let's jump to it. The results chapter, or sometimes this is called the findings or analysis chapter, is where things start getting exciting. Well, at least for a nerd like me. Up to this point in your dissertation or thesis, you've just spoken about what others have done and what you will be doing. Now it's time to actually get doing and show what you found. In the results chapter, your task is purely to present the results of your data collection and analysis, not to interpret them in relation to the literature or your research questions. The interpretation bit is covered in the next chapter, the discussion chapter. Now, this might seem a little bit awkward, especially for qualitative data, but splitting up presenting the results and interpreting the results, it can help keep things more digestible for the reader. Now, that being said, some universities do prefer students to combine the results and discussion chapter, blending the data and interpretation, so be sure to check with yours and understand what their preferences are. Okay, so how exactly do you approach this chapter? Well, it largely depends on your methodology, quantitative or qualitative. For quantitative studies, or research that was focused on numerical data, you'll usually start by presenting some basic statistics covering the demographic data. For example, statistics covering gender, age, ethnicity, and similar breakdowns. From there, you'll present your descriptive statistics, your means, averages, medians, modes, standard deviations, and so on. From there, you'll move on to inferential statistics, if they're needed, such as t-tests, correlations, regressions, and so on. Now, if this lingo sounds like gibberish to you, don't stress. I'll include a link to one of our blog posts that covers quantitative analysis methods. For qualitative studies, the approach is a little bit different, and it can vary quite a bit depending on your analysis approach. With qualitative research, you may not have a specific hypothesis, and thus you'd want to report on topics or themes that popped up during your analysis. Now, depending on your type of analysis, you would likely present a diagram explaining how you collapsed your codes into themes. Then you would name and define the themes, supporting these themes with quotes from your participants. Now, the key thing to remember is that you should show, not tell. In other words, be sure to quote your sources verbatim as to show what your research has found. Whatever you do, remember that the results chapter is purely about presenting the results. You should not be interpreting them or linking them back to your research questions, aims, and objectives just yet. Interpretation is what the next chapter is all about, unless, of course, your university wants you to merge them. So, on that note, let's jump into the discussions chapter. With the data clearly laid out in the results chapter, it's time to get down to business in the discussion chapter. Now, the discussion chapter is where you interpret your data and discuss your findings, hence the chapter name. So how do you craft a solid discussion chapter? Well, every project is a little different, but ideally you want to do the following in your discussion chapter. First, you need to interpret the data to develop meaningful findings. For example, if you found strong correlations between variables in your statistical analysis, you would explain what this potentially means in the terms of the relationship between them. For example, does factor A potentially cultivate or stimulate trust, while factor B has no impact? Secondly, you should relate your findings to the literature. In other words, do your findings align with the existing research, which you covered in your literature review chapter, or are they at odds with previous research? If so, why might that be? For example, if your findings are at odds with the existing research, could this potentially be due to a different contextual or maybe environmental factor, like culture or power dynamics? Lastly, and most importantly, you need to relate your findings to your original research questions. In other words, how do these findings help you address your research questions, aims, and objectives? Do they provide clear answers, or do they suggest that things are a little bit more nuanced than originally anticipated? For example, if your research question was asking which factors cultivate trust, you need to clearly state which factors seem to be linked to trust based on your data. A final note about the discussion chapter. It's important to remember that your discussion chapter needs to be deeply rooted in your results chapter. You can't present new data here or make claims that aren't connected to a data point in your results chapter. Every point you make here must have a supporting thread in the results chapter. Think about the discussion chapter as the glossy, front-ended web page and the results chapter as the complex back-end code. Everything on the web page is there because of a piece of supporting code. Right. With your findings clearly presented and discussed, you need to wrap up your dissertation and draw your final conclusions. Enter the conclusions chapter. You've presented your data and interpreted your findings. Now it's time to bring it all home and wrap things up neatly, which is what the conclusions chapter is all about. Its job is to tie your research together and highlight the key takeaways. A useful thing to keep in mind is that someone who knows nothing about your research, a layman on the street, should be able to read your introduction chapter and then your conclusions chapter and nothing in between, and still have a clear idea of exactly what you wanted to figure out, meaning your research aims and objectives, and what you ultimately found, meaning your findings in relation to your research questions. Your family and friends should be able to easily digest this, saving them the potential pain of reading an entire manuscript just to understand what it is that you study. So, how exactly do you pull together your whole dissertation or thesis in this chapter? Well, again, every project is a little different, but a good way to structure this chapter is as follows. First, remind the reader what you wanted to find out. In other words, your research aims, objectives, and questions. Then, state clearly what you discovered, your key findings. Then relate those findings back to your research aims, objectives, and questions. In other words, explain how your findings helped answer your research questions. Now, once you've done that, discuss the limitations of your research. What were the potential issues in your study? Perhaps your sample size was too small, or your data analysis wasn't sophisticated enough due to technology issues. Here, you should also give suggestions as to how the study could be improved and what other researchers could do to improve it, which is where the implications and recommendations come into play. So lastly, discuss the implications and recommendations. For example, how can practitioners make use of your research and the new knowledge it's generated? What should future researchers look into? Things like that. By covering these areas, you'll bring your research full circle. You'll answer your research questions and discuss the implications of your research, both for industry and for academia. As I mentioned earlier, a layman should be able to read your intro chapter and your conclusion chapter and have a clear understanding of what your project was all about. So, when you're writing your conclusion chapter, it's a good idea to reread your introduction chapter a few times to get your head in the zone, to ensure that you tie it all together. You don't want any loose ends. Your conclusion chapter should circle back to everything you touched on in your introduction chapter. And remember to make use of simple language here. Stay away from complicated and niche terminology. Yes, I know this can be difficult, but a layman will likely not understand what you mean by anti-disestablishmentarianism. Now with the conclusion chapter out of the way, it's smooth sailing to the end. All that's left is your reference list and appendices. So let's go take a quick look at that. All right, on to the final stretch. The very last section of a typical dissertation or thesis structure is the reference list and the appendices. Let's check these out. The reference list is one of those things that all too often gets neglected by students. At this stage of the dissertation writing process, everyone's tired and just wants to wrap things up. So it's really no surprise that the reference list doesn't get much love. But that's really a shame, since it's an essential part of any high quality piece of research and possibly the easiest area of the dissertation to earn marks. So, how do you craft the perfect reference list? Well, it's actually a lot easier than most students think. The key is to use reference management software, and I'll explain more about that in a minute, and to log your reference data from day one. Keep track of each article's details as you read it, ideally within your reference management software. Don't leave referencing right until the end of your writing. Log the citation as you go and insert your citations as you write. Okay, enough of the lecture. Back to reference management software. Now, hopefully this isn't news to you, but so many students we work with at Grad Coach seem to be making the huge mistake of writing out references and citations manually. Not only is this a massively time-consuming headache, but it will always result in errors. The only way to manage your references properly is with reference management software. There are loads of options, but the two ones that are free that we always recommend are Mendeley and Zotero. Now, we've made video guides for both of them, and I'll include the links to those below this video. If you're manually typing out your references, stop now and go watch these videos. On to the appendices. This section is pretty straightforward, but there are a few important points to make. First up, the appendices are a place for additional, non-essential supporting info. They're a place for nice-to-haves, not for essential content. Core content needs to go in the body of your dissertation, like the results or discussion chapter. Your reader should not have to jump between your chapters and your appendices to make sense of your arguments. Generally, the contents in the appendices cannot earn marks, so don't abuse this section to reduce your word count. Second, each appendix needs to be clearly labeled and linked to within your body content. You need to mention Appendix A, Appendix B, and so on at the relevant points in your chapters. The appendices cannot be orphan sections. They need to be linked to in the core content. When you get to finalizing your appendices, make sure that you revise your entire thesis to check that you reference the correct appendix. Incorrect references here can confuse the reader and make them think that you might have made things up. This will lose you marks. Lastly, your appendices shouldn't be huge. It's hard to prescribe a number here, but I'd say your page count for appendices shouldn't be more than 20 to 30% of your entire document. Super lengthy appendices will just bloat your document and blow up your printing costs. If you're over 30%, you might want to consider rather bundling that content into a downloadable, password-protected zip file and simply including the download link in an appendix. Keep these 3 points in mind when you compile your appendices, and you'll have a happy and hopefully generous marker on your hands. All right, so now we've covered the standard structure of a classic dissertation or thesis. To recap, the core sections are: first, the opening section, which is your title page, abstract, acknowledgments, and table of contents, followed by the introduction chapter, the literature review chapter, the methodology chapter, results chapter, discussion chapter, conclusions chapter, and finally the closing section, which is your reference list and appendices. If you follow this, you'll have a dissertation structure that reflects the research process and presents a smooth flowing discussion in a logical order. Remember, your research questions should be at the heart of your project, so you need to keep them in mind as you work through each chapter. If you connect each chapter to your research questions, you'll have a golden thread that runs through your dissertation structure, which is the hallmark of a quality dissertation or thesis. Now, one last tip. While we've looked at the overall structure of the typical dissertation or thesis here, it's also really useful to think about the structure of each of your chapters before you start writing. It's a really good idea to loosely map out a structure for each chapter so that when you get to writing, you will have a clear direction and roadmap. By doing this, you'll keep your writing organized and stop yourself from waffling. Of course, the structure can change as you work your way through each chapter, but at least you'll have some sort of guiding structure to start with. Again, you can find guidance on our blog regarding potential structures for key chapters, such as the literature review. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and leave a comment if you have any questions. And if you're in the writing process of your dissertation or thesis, be sure to subscribe to the Grad Coach channel for more research-related content. Lastly, if you need a helping hand with your research, check out our private coaching service where we work with you on a one-on-one basis, chapter by chapter, to ensure that you craft a winning dissertation. If that sounds interesting to you, book a free consultation with a friendly coach at www.gradcoach.com. As always, I'll include a link below. And that is all for this episode of Grad Coach TV. Until next time, good luck.